Welcome to the Washington Defender Podcast. I'm your host, Pastor Brian Noble, CEO of Family Policy Institute of Washington. We are at Roanoke, and we are having a great time in Ocean Shores at the conference here, and we have everyone from moderate conservatives to ultra-conservatives and everything in between. We even have some Democrats who've shown up and interviewed with us today, so that's been a lot of fun just to hear the different perspectives. And so I have Elizabeth. Introduce yourselves to us.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Dole. I am wearing a few different hats at the Roanoke Conference. So first and foremost, I am an executive board member of the conference. I'm the secretary for the conference. I've been attending. This is my 12th year at Roanoke.
12 years, wow.
And I think this is my 4th year on the board.
Wow.
Give or take one, because I might be wrong in either direction.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. We won't hold you to it. So tell us a little bit about the history of Roanoke, and then, or really whatever you want to talk about, what you're passionate about. But since you brought this up, I would love to hear some history.
Yeah, so the Roanoke Conference originated all the way back in 2009 with a group of young Republicans who were sitting around at a bar called the Roanoke Bar on Mercer Island.
I was wondering where the name came from.
That is where the name came from.
Okay.
And they thought there should really be an organization or a conference out there for young Republicans to gather in Washington state and be able to network with political professionals in the state, to be able to find internships, to be able to connect on jobs, to learn about policy, to understand how politics worked in the state from people with a lot of experience. That was a really low barriers opportunity for relationship building and networking. And that would also bring together the various factions of Republicans within Washington state, because we do have to be a big tent to win elections.
Right.
And
I want you to say that again, because I think a lot of people are missing. There's not one part of the tent that can actually win.
Right. We have to be a big tent to win elections.
Right.
That is a requirement.
Right.
Republicans, as well, you guys probably didn't see it because you're just listeners. In a presentation this morning with some data, self-identified Republicans are nowhere near 50% of the state of Washington.
That's exactly right.
We have to be a big tent to win. So Roanoke was conceived as a way to enable that big tent conversation, and also to really create a farm team from young people all the way up to people whose entire careers and lives had been dedicated to conservative politics in the state.
Now, I think one of the things that when we say big tent, or we say you have to have that whole base, people hear compromise. And this is what I like to tell people is, guess what? Politics is, to a certain degree, a type of compromise. You have to negotiate for a position. You're not going to get all of your way all of the time. Is that accurate or inaccurate?
That is very accurate, especially in Washington state.
Right.
Although I will also say that there's a lot of space to find common ground, which can lead me into the next part of the conversation, maybe about my work, my full-time job.
Yeah.
So there are places where you can find common ground when you are able to build relationships and be collaborative with people who are not necessarily part of your faction or even your party, where you discover you do have things in common on topics that you may not have explored, but for a relationship that you built with them.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you always have to compromise. Sometimes it means discovering that you can come together on a bill helping domestic violence survivors or something like that.
Right.
Something to do with education often. There are a lot of Democrats that are actually pro-school choice. I'm friends with a few even on Bainbridge, one who is ardently pro-school choice.
Yeah, and I think this is where it's difficult, because, I mean, most people, when they look at me, they would say, okay, this guy probably is an ultra-conservative, right? I believe life starts at conception. I believe limited government, low tax. I mean, they just put me in that kind of that category, right? And probably rightfully so. But I'm at the point where it's like, okay, but how do we win so people can afford a house? How do we win so that people can afford to have children? You know, like if we can't win on some of those other things, we're not going to move the ball forward. And so finding the areas of agreement, I think, is great.
Yeah. And, housing is another one. There's a whole faction now mostly of younger Democrats, younger progressives even, who I disagree with on virtually everything else.
Right.
But on housing, they've come around to recognizing that the only way to decrease housing prices is to increase supply and build more housing. And so all of a sudden, we're on the same page about cutting government regulation and removing some of the barriers from the energy code and decreasing, actually opposing rent control, decreasing a lot of the barriers that increase the cost of housing in Western Washington, in the Puget Sound, and really all over the state.
Right.
One thing that I'm very fond of saying is one issue is one issue.
Right.
And so these are examples of places where being able to build relationships across the aisle and being able to be that quote unquote big tent doesn't mean compromise. It also can mean finding common ground.
That's
and
right.
treating one issue like one issue.
Right.
Finding places where you can collaborate on something where neither one of you has to compromise your principles, where you actually agree. And that doesn't mean that you have to work with them on anything else.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you have to agree with their stances on anything else. In fact, that relationship might be a starting point for you to have a conversation about a more accurate understanding of each other's disagreements on other topics.
Yeah, exactly right.
But you don't have to compromise on that one issue you're working on. You just found a spot you agree.
You agree, and that's exactly true. And when I say compromise, what I mean is like I've had people not like this stance, but for instance, if we were to take property tax, and you say, well, we're at this level, I am for going to no property tax would be my ultimate level, because I believe you're still renting your land from the government, and I don't think that's true ownership, right? So I think we should find other ways to tax to take care of shared resources versus property. And I say that because I love our old people, and I've met way too many old people who have to sell their house because they can't afford the property tax, right? They didn't prepare for retirement, and they can't afford to live in their own home. I think that's not right.
Senior exemptions are a wonderful thing. More people should know they exist.
Yeah, and I've had people apply for them and they're just denied them. They flat out. I mean, and it's because there's that line and they're just barely over it,
right?
And so it's very difficult, and it applies to very few. But the same thing, I don't believe that you're supposed to. I believe in property ownership, and I don't believe you're supposed to be renting that. At the same time, I'm not going to wait until someone goes to that, because I know it's not a realistic bill. So baby steps backwards are okay with me, right? Because we're moving in the right direction on property tax. I think that's perfectly fine. And there's people who just flat out say, well, I won't work with anyone if they're not all or nothing.
Incrementalism is how you make progress.
Right.
In a state where you are in a minority, you will not get everything that you desire, especially not in one go. The analogy that I've often used is if you have a toddler who wants a cookie and they ask you really nicely and they promise you that they're going to eat their vegetables, and you tell them that they have to behave and they have to wait until after dinner and then they can have a cookie. Or you might actually give them a cookie.
Right.
Or maybe you don't, because you know that they're going to be a terror at bedtime if they have a whole cookie.
Right.
But because they were respectful and they obeyed you and they didn't throw a tantrum over their vegetables,
Right.
you give them half of a cookie or a quarter of a cookie. That's still better for the child than no cookie at all,
Right.
which is the actual alternative that you can offer.
Right.
The same thing applies in a government dominated by your political opposition. There is no option where you get the whole cookie.
Yeah.
Because
typically there's not. I mean,
they have control.
Yeah.
You can settle
Right.
for, after arguing and negotiating and pushing and fighting, maybe you get a quarter of the cookie.
Right.
And you're not going to get more than that.
Yeah.
You have to learn to take wins where you can get them and recognize where your options are. Take what has been offered and try to move the ball forward some other day again,
Right.
or walk away and get nothing.
Yeah, and it's politics are an area of persuasion, right? And so it's both cultural persuasion and individual persuasion that we are working on. Is how do we move ideas forward? How do we do that? And what I find is interesting is in the camp of or the spectrum of conservatism, Most of the people agree on the what, right? So they agree on the what's for the most part, But it's the how do we get there is where there's just a lot of things. And then what we do is we assign evil intentions to anyone who has a different how. And somehow we have to overcome that as a movement.
If you disagree with me on policy, you hate all the things that I love.
Right.
And yeah, that's just the vast majority of the time. That is simply not at all accurate.
Right.
We may have wildly different conceptions about definitions of things. Mm-hmm. We may have extraordinarily different ideas about whether a particular policy accomplishes a shared desired outcome.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we can't both be engaging in good faith, trying to pursue a similar value or trying to pursue a similar conclusion.
Right.
And I think that those are things more people should understand.
Yeah.
Simultaneously, I think the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes people imagine that if you believe someone is engaging in good faith and you engage in good faith with them on a policy and you believe that they have shared values with you and shared concluding outcomes, that you can't hate their how anymore.
Right.
And that's just not true. You can ardently disagree with someone's how. You can think that their policy prescription applied to their value is incredibly counterproductive, is in fact sometimes downright evil in terms of its outcomes, and also believe that they are pursuing that thing that you think is evil through the best of intent.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that because we can do the same thing. There's a line that I'm going to butcher because I don't have it memorized by philosopher Alexander Solzhenitsyn. That's something like the line between good and evil doesn't run through any party or religion. It runs through every human heart.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot in terms of politics.
Yeah.
We can all have the best of intentions and be on the road to hell.
It's exactly right. And it's just one of those things where we have to learn is how do we have this conversation and how do we speak truth and love? That's how I look at it. Is how do you be abundantly truthful? There's nothing wrong with being truthful. It's celebrated, but there's rude truth. Like you can be rude about it as well, but you can do it with compassion where you look out for the other person's interest as well. So we've come to the end of our time together. What a great conversation. Thanks for engaging with me. Any closing remarks before we go?
I think I briefly mentioned my job and then I didn't actually mention what it was.
Okay, go ahead.
So I work for an organization called Braver Angels, and we organize workshops to help people have healthier conversations with each other across the political divide about their political disagreements.
Okay.
I run their politics program nationally, so I do listening and speaking skills training for public officials, candidates, staff members, party leaders all over the country at different levels of government. And so I do a lot of work trying to help people find common ground, even where they didn't expect it, and also helping people find accuracy in their disagreements so that they are not stereotyping each other.
That's right.
And instead they're arguing with what they really disagree about.
So how do people get a hold of you at that organization?
Braverangels.org.
Braverangels.org.
Yes.
All right.
For the Washington State group, you can go to wa.braverangels.org.
Okay. So put Washington at the beginning, WA?
Yep.
All right. Well, we're so thankful to have you on today and hope that the rest of the conference, you just have a great time.
Thank you.
Let me do my closing remarks. Here we go. So if you haven't downloaded that Washington Defender app, want to encourage you to do that. Go to the Google Play or Apple App Store, download Washington Defender. It's one place to learn, one place to huddle, and one place to activate in the public square. We are so encouraged that you listen today. And like we like to say around here, go out there and defend and advance conservative values. God bless.